Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I'm the Training Peaks WKO4 product manager leader. Great to see everybody joining, and I'm amazed to see this super large turnout on a Friday night. Sorry that it is a Friday night. I know it's a little atypical, but it looks like plenty of people didn't mind and are joining up. So great to see everyone. Actually, I still see people joining. So tonight we're going to be talking about interval training. It's really part one of two of a session, but we're going to kind of go through that in a little bit. I want to introduce Dean Golich. Dean really is probably one of the most experienced people in coaching for cycling, a master coach. His history and background, and he might give you a little bit more, really goes back to the USOC. Has spent a tremendous amount of time with Carmichael Training Systems. Has coached numerous pros, Olympians, world championship attendees, and has quite a history of success in this field. I can personally tell you that, I've learned a tremendous amount of stuff from Dean. He's one of the smartest guys in cycling that I know. Not to give him a big head here and a big send-off, but he really knows the stuff. And what I really like is he has a great way of making it understandable. He's very down to earth in his approach about how to get this stuff done. Dean's been doing this for a long time, so he's going to give you some excellent guidance. One of the things Dean and I were just talking about is after my max aerobic, there was a lot of confusion about intervals, and are intervals anaerobic, are intervals aerobic? And the fact that we're getting those questions really showed me the need to do more education here, and this is Dean's area of absolute expertise, so it's great. As you go through today's presentation, there are two things I want to tell you. Please feel free to ask questions. Dean will be watching questions, and we can always come back and answer them later. So in the little box on the right-hand side, you can open and close that with this arrow. And one of the options is questions, and you can put a question here, and it'll show up in our little question box on our side. The second thing is, if you go down a little further from questions, one of the things in your box, you have a tab called Handouts. Dean's PDF, a version of his presentation in PDF format, is in there. If you click on it and open it, it'll allow you to download it so you can actually have the PDF of his presentation. Tonight's session is recorded, so we will be sharing it on our YouTube playlist and back in the Facebook group, but so that you can rewatch or re-see, or if you miss something or skip a spot. So based on that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean. So it's going to take us 1 second, and as Dean, the presentation is coming to you, and it's going to say, please share your screen. Excuse me, everybody. And now we can see your screen, and you're going full screen, so we see you in full screen. So Dean, it's in your hands. Let me know if you have any questions.
All right. Glad to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming or attending. It's going to be an interesting presentation. After dealing with intervals for so long, when you go to do a presentation on interval training, basically it comes down to, well, it doesn't come down to anything. That's the point. You end up researching basically how to train. So as we go through it, it's difficult to do a presentation on interval training because it's so multifaceted. You get into the physiological side of training, you get into the design of training, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So right now we're going to try to do this in two parts. And we're going to, originally I was a little bit nervous because I didn't have any WKO4 stuff at the beginning, middle, or end in the part one. It was mostly all the research and the design and the effect of intervals. So then because I was nervous, I went back and kind of reworked it. So we'll see how this first part goes. So let's see here. Okay, so everything I'm going to say, and hopefully everyone understands this, you can qualify it. So the definition of qualify: by satisfying the relevant conditions or requirements. So a 3-minute interval doesn't really mean much if you don't know what the recovery is and you don't know what the intensity is. So when someone says they're doing VO2 intervals, well, that could mean about anything. So, but most of us would think about a physiological definition of VO2 max intervals and say, okay, that's between 2 and 5 minutes. but in reality you can get VO2 max a number of different ways, as you could get an anaerobic component a number of different ways with different time frames or rest periods or so on. So to limit or modify the meaning of. So if you can kind of keep this in the background, this is kind of the topic of the whole presentation, is how we qualify everything we're going to say or prescribe within the interval session. So these first few slides, if you just started here and said, okay, excuse me, I have my optimized prescription, optimized interval prescription, and for right now we'll look at the left-hand side where it says FRC, FTP, max aerobic. If you said, I'm going to work on intervals that are max aerobic, and I have a target duration here, which is 3 minutes and 20 seconds. My target power was 305 plus or minus 10. I did 3 to 8 reps, 12 to 30 minutes, and a 1-to-1 ratio or a 1-to-2 ratio. You would get about 95 to 99% achievement. So that's when I was doing this presentation, that's the first thing that I thought of, is you can pretty much screw it all up and it'll work. It's that when you get down into the weeds, and mostly from what the perceived or anecdotal information out there, that's generally the problem. It's not what you've kind of read in a textbook or what you've used personally and then you've seen the result of that. I feel like Andy and Tim and Kevin and everyone who's designed WKO4, prior to this, we had to say, okay, we knew VO2 max was between 2 and 5 minutes. So you just prescribed intervals between 2 and 5 minutes. Now it basically tells you the length that is going to work specifically for you or individually into your range, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. And then it gives you a power prescription, gives you a time, and gives you an interval number, and then it gives you basically a ratio for that. So like I said, even if you didn't listen to the rest of part 1 and part 2, here's basically how I look at it. So for example, if we're talking about maximum aerobic interval training, 3 minutes and 20 like I just said, then the next phase, I would come over here to that 3 minutes. I have it, the dotted line, vertical line there at 3 minutes and 34 seconds. But basically I would look at this power duration curve, which is the light blue line. Then I would look at the mean maximal power for the last 28 days. Then I have my peaks in there, which are the yellow dots. And then I have the targets. So those targets are colored, obviously. So the green is the tempo on the far right. Far left is the Pmax, and then right in the middle between the FTP high, which is the pink line, and the FRC low, which is the light blue line. Right where I have the dotted line in the middle of that is our max aerobic capability. So then this gives us our range and limits. You do the interval training, you look at the mean maximal data, and then you can do this a couple of different ways. So sometimes you can look at this is a athlete view. You can do the reverse of this and go into the workout view and then overlay this on top of it. So for example, this is the athlete view. I could look at the workout or the best for that day to day and then chart it at that 334. If I prescribed a maximal interval for that day at that time frame at 320 or 330 in this case, and then where it ended up on the chart, the mean maximal chart. Now you can also do that on the workout day. So you would have the workout and then overlaid on top of that athlete view like this, or power duration curve and mean maximal curve. You would have the mean maximal or power duration curve, well, mean maximal curve of that actual workout, and then the peaks to show you where you were. So again, we have our optimized prescription. We have a time frame. It's predicted by the software. It's actually pretty accurate. And So right now, in the first part of this presentation, the first 5 or 6 slides, we'd be playing checkers. And then as we go through this, the analysis is we're going to then start playing chess. So for example, now we have our range and we have our limits, we have our time frame, and where that workout corresponded to the actual range and limits. Then we track it. So now we've done the workout. Was it in the range? Was it of the time frame? Was it of the power in your prescription? And then you tracked it. So in this case, you would look at the VO2 max, which is the blue line, the upper blue line. And then you can look at your FTP if that's important. You can look at your percent of VO2 max and where you are. This just tracks what you are trying to work on. Now one thing, again, I will qualify is you can do endurance training and change your VO2 max. Endurance, our typical long, slow distance. You can do short sprint training and train our VO2 max. So I want to get that right out there, that a lot of times when people are prescribing something that's if you're at the very elite end, it's really hard to see the improvement in that VO2 max. So say I did 6 efforts of our 3 minutes and 20 in our aerobic zone, and I prescribe them at say 95% of that effort at little less than 305, which was our previous example. Well, then you don't ever see best. So therefore, when you go to chart the best, it doesn't show the best. Now, if all the time I prescribe VO2 intervals at maximal, like go out as hard as you can, get through the 3 minutes, and then just fatigue throughout the workout, well then I may see best. So then I may get a change in best. So you have to be careful of how you're prescribing that. Well, you don't have to be careful, just be aware of that, and that's how you qualify some of the data then going forward. So this is just a charting. You would look at that VO2 max, and in this case I have the prescribed 5-minute top 20s, or not prescribed, the best top 20s over the top of that to see where they occur. Do they occur at VO2 max? Because 5 minutes is probably a good indication of your VO2 max, and so on. So that's what I'm really trying to say is, okay, we prescribed it, we got it, now we're going to track it, and does it track with the time frame that you are trying to improve? And then the one issue is a lot of times, since if you did prescribe intervals in that 3 minute and 20 second, and say you did 7 of them, 3 minute and 20 second on, 3 minute off, you did 7 of them, 21 minutes worth of work time, and you prescribe them at 95%, well, you don't generally see any of the numbers going up as far as mean maximal or best. So then you have to look at, throughout that time frame, do you see a change in your fatigue resistance? So this is the next chart that I would look at. So a lot of times, again, at the elite level and somewhat at the middle to amateur low level, like someone who's just getting into the sport, whether it's triathlon, cycling, running, you don't see a lot of improvement on their best. You see a lot of improvement on their fatigue resistance at that time frame. So this is the next chart that I look at, which is if I compare all of 2015 versus the last 120 days, what is my fatigue resistance at that time frame from doing 3 weeks of interval training? So then you want to make sure, well, then you look at to see if was my fatigue resistance better even though I was prescribing intervals at 100%, say that 3 minutes and 20 seconds at 305 watts, or was I prescribing them to do more work time at 300 watts? So then you start to put that time frame together to see if you had a fatigue resistance. Then the next thing is, once I feel like I gained something, so I showed that what was prescribed, I actually improved, and or I saw an improvement in the fatigue resistance, then I look at the power duration curve after a certain amount of work. Again, that's more looking at that fatigue resistance and where it charts out. So this, again, all the pink shaded is the power duration curve. The white lines are mean maximal, and then the dotted white is mean maximal after 2,000 kilojoules. So that's, again, the kind of turquoise or aqua line is your power duration curve after 2,000 kilojoules of work. So again, I would section that off, go over to 3 minutes, look if where we are on 3 minutes, and to see if I improved after 1,000 kilojoules of work, 2,000 kilojoules of work, and where that time frame improved to make sure that I was matching it. And a lot of times you won't see it on the power duration curve, but you'll see it on the mean maximal curve, a little blip, if that's the range you are working on. So after all that's said, so I'm going to go back through this and just systematically. Okay, we had our max aerobic. It's 3 minutes and 20 seconds. We have a prescription. We have a time frame. We have how much work you need to do in that time frame. Then I charted it out as far as the range. You can do this vertically or horizontally. There's a number of different charts in the library that show where you're working. Then I saw from a physiologically, well, from aerobic tracking or physiological system estimate, was it improving? And partly that improvement is due to how much time you're spending there in the data and the modeling too. So then I looked to see if I was more fatigue resistant, and then I looked at my power duration curve after a certain amount of work to see if I improved it there. Now all of that is qualified because did you get the volume of intensity right? So you could go through all that exactly as I just discussed and not get any improvement. Or you could do the exact same thing at different times of the year and get quite a lot of improvement. So in the end, it comes back to the volume of intensity. So did you need 4 weeks of interval training at VO2? Did you need more sessions during the week for 3 weeks? Did you need less sessions for 5 weeks? And so then you start to understand that the exact same model that will work, or structure of how you develop your interval training or prescribe it, is not working or is working through no fault of your own till you individualize the training. So if you would have done 1 more week, you would have got the improvement. Or if you would have upped the intensity from doing 305 watts to over 310 watts for a specific individual. So that's where it starts to get out of the checkers realm and into the chess. But I would say that, again, you will probably be 95% successful, and you can probably just stop with the presentation. You could do it all right then, or as we prescribed with the optimized intervals, and you'll probably be just as successful as if you micromanaged every interval, recovery phase, time frame. Now, you may not get the results for the reason you think you're getting the results, but you'll still get results. So the next phase, and now this kind of goes in, so that's your WKO4 primer and teaser, but now we're going to kind of get into the chest side. So this is the targeted physiological systems for all different types of intervals. So we want to make sure in this part 1 that we're all on the same page of what intervals you're prescribing is targeting what you're actually trying to prescribe. And in number 1, this is the number 1 problem that I have whenever I'm talking to coaches. They'll say, oh, I did my VO2 intervals, as if all intervals are the same. Well, you know, 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 2 minutes. And so there's a preconception or anecdotal information that that's exactly what it's doing. And then when you get deeper into it, and well, I do 3 minutes on, 30 seconds off. Those are VO2 intervals. And another coach or sports scientist as well, oh, no, I do 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. So in the end, those are different physiological systems, and you'll see the differences as we go through it. So we've all seen this. We'll go through it again, and I'll refer back to it and why I put it in here. I'm not much for putting in the physiological stuff because I think we've seen it a million times before, but really I'm trying to correct behavior in myself and our, I guess, our world of coaching and cycling, triathlon, and so on. So We have basically the three systems. You're either splitting stored phosphagens, that's your CP or PCR, phosphocreatine. Your non-aerobic breakdown of carbohydrate, that's glycolytic, and our breakdown of carbohydrates and fats aerobically. Now, that pretty much will describe everything we're going to do, but you have a contribution of those three systems in all different types of intervals, and I'll show you this as we go along. We won't talk too much about neuromuscular load or musculoskeletal strain, but those are involved as well. It's the contribution of the three systems. And maybe I'll do a part 3 to this at some point and go through the sprinting side of this, because the sprinters kind of get left out on a lot of this, but they're in the exact same predicament that we're going to focus on the VO2 side and the FTP side today, or anaerobic and FTP side. So here's the classic charts. So you have the classic levels on the left and kind of how we describe them, descriptive. You have what you're targeting, and then you have the cog and eye levels on the right. So pretty self-explanatory. Everyone's seen this before. The problem is everyone, it seems like there's a huge assumption that when you prescribe an interval, say we're looking at number 4 on the right-hand side and number 4 on the left-hand side, we get lactate threshold or threshold, which now we would say maybe modeled functional threshold or our set functional threshold power. And so that says, okay, we're in the aerobic power, and we go forward with that. But what does that mean? Does that mean 1 hour time trialing, 30 minutes time trialing, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for an hour, 1 minute on, 1 minute off for an hour? Virtually every one of those examples I just gave are the exact same thing in level 4. But we don't think of it that way for some reason, and that's why a lot of times the prescription and interval training gets all sidetracked. So then again, this is just another version of that, our physiological adaptations, and obviously the more X's, the more you're stressing that system. So if we just go straight down from the sweet spot training, when you look at it, you have to laugh to yourself, because sweet spot, well, 0.5, so 30 minutes to 3 hours. That's a pretty big range of training. But it still gives me the double X's, quadruple X's, and so on as we go through it on what I'm trying to adapt. So let's say it's in mitochondrial enzymes on the left-hand side, third example down. Well, it doesn't say for 30 minutes I get more mitochondria, or 3 hours I get less, even though it's a continuum. So that's where we've run into the problems. And the same with zone 4. It's 8 minutes to 30 minutes. Well, that's a big range. What does that mean? Obviously, I go slower for 30 minutes. Well, what if I did, 6 by 5 minute intervals and got 30 minutes worth of work time? Would I get the same level of mitochondrial enzyme, activity? So that's why whenever I hear, or whenever I talk with people, and originally this is how I thought, years and years ago, which was, you have an interval, you prescribe it, it gets you this adaptation. The problem is normally all the data and all the prescription graphs, charts, and everything are based off of one interval. So they say 8 minutes. That would be your threshold zone. 3 to 6 in this case for zone 5 VO2 max. It's saying what it is for 3 minutes. But again, if you do 3 on, max effort, 1 off for 21 minutes worth of work time, you are not in VO2 max anymore. So we'll go through that, and I want to make sure everyone understands, and that's why we'll go with the questions and try to develop this. There's a couple questions that I'll get to. Yeah, I can use the pointer, no problem. And yeah, so in the chart library, I'll try to go back through that. You can also get the raw presentation. And the question was to try to name the charts so we can go pick them out. So some of these are adapted, and I don't know who created them. I've copied them. Some I created. But if you any doubt, in the worst case scenario, which takes a little bit of time, is get that PDF in the notes and just go to the library and copy them. And I'll work with Tim to try to get you the names of these. So here's a good thing, or kind of a good start, that we're talking about our one interval sessions. So if you have a 10-second, and so we're right here, straight down, 10 seconds. I go straight down. Dark green is the aerobic system, lactate system, ATP, CP, so that's our PCR phosphocreatine system, and how much or percentage is being worked. And then as you go on in time, so this is indicating, and this is part of the problem whenever we do presentations, I'm using this as a negative, not as a positive, is that it's saying that for one interval, this is the percentage that's being used. It's not saying for 10-second intervals, this is the percentage of the physiological systems being used. So again, if I did 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off for an hour, 10 seconds on, 2 minutes off for an hour, you're going to get different contributions. The longer you go with any type of intensity that says, well, see, and that's the other problem. I can't say 90% or 85% of your functional threshold power. It could be less for 10 seconds. You just have to keep going with a certain amount of volume, and pretty soon you'll be aerobic. So then here's a more applicable description. Because without intensity here, we don't have a real description of the 0, 10 seconds, 3 minutes, and 2 hour time frame. It just assumes you're working that. But if you do high intensity, you're going to obviously, for one interval, be in the CP system, medium intensity lactate threshold. But as you do more of these, you're going to go into the aerobic system more, right from the start, as you do more and more. And then low intensity, more and more. So we're looking at time frames again of a single bout. And that's part of the problem of how we've got down this road of what develops what. Because 10 seconds of anything doesn't tell you anything. How hard you go for 10 seconds and then how long the recovery is tells you a lot about the system you're going to be working. So this goes back to qualifying. And this is kind of the most important part, is really the top part. The bottom part is kind of what we just talked about. So it's what is the demands of the sport? What are your long-term adaptations? What's the athlete profile? So Andy Coggan has done a good job of getting that phenotype. Does that mean 7 by 3 on, 3 off of our 300 watts of 21 minutes worth of work time? Does that athlete profile of someone who's more of an anaerobic, fast twitch per se, or someone who's more aerobic, does that profile lead to the same adaptation? Do the cycles of 4 weeks, 6 weeks, daily training, does that change the input to qualify all this? So there's a lot of examples of preconceived notions. One of them is, well, you can't do that many intervals during the week. Well, it's not the intervals that are the problem. Maybe it's the recovery and the other writing you do. So and this is how I first developed this, is in college. Our study was an overtraining study. The problem is we couldn't get anyone to overtrain. And that's with 5 days of intervals, of 3-minute intervals, max. Every interval was max, as hard as they could go. And it was double days. And then that was 5 days. And then on the other 2 days, we did a performance test, a maximal pursuit, and then we did a VO2 test, a maximal VO2 test. So for 3 weeks, we try, and all the blood markers, all the hormonal markers, everything would indicate, massive fatigue. But after 5 days of rest, every one of these individuals hit their best powers test VO2 that they ever had. After 7 days, they were a little bit better. After 10 days, they were even better. So it's not there's a complete interaction, and I'm probably beating this to death. But as you go through the presentation, maybe it'll start to come clear of why I'm beating it to death. So again, when you're on the far left, we have the metabolic O2 system, and we're looking at the mitochondria, heart and lungs, muscle. Then it's metabolic with the O2 and a little bit of neuromuscular, what the force is. And then we're metabolic O2 anaerobic. And so you're seeing that you will get, even on short intervals, less than 60 seconds, you get an O2 demand. And this is why these charts are so important, is because we're trying to put together that there is a huge contribution of a lot of the energy systems in a time frame of intervals that you would not normally associate it with. So then when I look at the individual trainability, this is VO2 max trainability and high intensity interval training. And so this is a meta-analysis. This is all these papers that are training VO2 max. And so over here, this line is 0. So everything disfavors interval training, everything over here favors interval training. So when you go through all these papers, and there's a million different designs, you can look at the trends of that they favor interval training. And then so you can go into certain amounts of or go into the details of these papers, and then you can actually find, well, was it 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, and you can start to put together a little better picture. What you will find when you go through all the papers is there's a million ways to do VO2 intervals, and they are all beneficial. Some are less than others, some are more than others, but it would still go back to the individual athlete. And you can monitor that. That's the greatest part about the VO2 or the WKO4 side of this, is you go and monitor your improvement, and you see if they aren't improving at the end of 4 weeks, well, we can go to 5. I can change the intensity. I can do a number of things, and that's what this presentation is trying to give you, some of those tools. So then we went back to mitochondria. So we had VO2, we had endurance, and now we're in the indication of endurance capacity, which is mitochondria. I should mention there's 2 different ways to look at this. There's mitochondria, that endurance training gives us more volume of mitochondria or density of mitochondria. But in this case, this is maximal mitochondria respiration. So at the elite level, you may have as much mitochondria as you're going to get, but you need to change the respiration or how active it can be. So this is a paper of what intervals and intensity. So this SIT here is sprint interval training, high intensity interval training, so it just gives you a percentage. And then the mixed interval training, high intensity interval training, and again, this is the intensity. And so you can start to see where the respiration of that mitochondria is increased. So there's one thing to create it. It's another thing to create its, efficiency is a bad word, but it's activity or capacity for activity. So then you start to look at these different intervals. So if you want to increase the mitochondria respiration, it looks like you probably should be exercising in your intervals greater than 82%. And then once you get too high at 120%, you're in sprint interval training, you're probably not increasing the respiration. But again, if we went back to qualify every part of this, if I gave enough rest, I probably could get some mitochondria respiration. Or if I didn't give enough rest, pretty soon this 120% is not going to be produced. So they're going to fall off throughout the interval session anyways, and they're going to end up back at 90% working that mitochondrial respiration. So just an indication of aerobic activity. Then another thing people talk about is buffering capacity. So here we have in red, and red up here, and a lot of these charts, this is the greatest thing, is I put them all in here so you guys can refer to them later and adapt, improvise, whatever you qualify. So the red is the aerobic, less than lactate threshold. And you can see the change in muscle buffering capacity. Then you see intervals, 30 seconds, all out sprint with 4-minute recovery. So again, not a lot of muscle buffering capacity. But if you do 2-minute intervals, add a lactate threshold plus 40% with a 1-minute recovery, you're producing lactate, and that is the most change in muscle buffering capacity. Then there's intervals 2 minutes at lactate threshold plus 70%. So again, with 1-minute recovery, that's a little less. Okay? And then as we get to repeated sprint training, that's a little bit less. And then intervals, 2 minutes at 100% of wattage peak, 1 minute recovery, not a lot of change in muscle buffering capacity. Now, I will say, and when you go through all the interval papers, just because you have better muscle buffering capacity doesn't necessarily mean you have improved performance, and there's a number of papers to show that. So now that goes back to, I did these intervals you told me to that are in the blues aqua range here, and I was working on my buffering capacity, but I didn't improve my time trial performance, or I didn't repeat my ability to attack and go off the front in a criterion, which is what, you know, again, our preconceived notion would be. So that's part of that issue, is now you have to have a performance measure. I got a couple questions, so I'll dump into those a little right now. Okay, so the mitochondrial is not the enzyme activity. There's some enzymes that they test for to see what the respiration will be. So it's actually the respiration of the mitochondria, not the enzymatic activity. The meta-analysis of the papers, we'll go through some of that here coming up. That was just to show you a trend. So I'm going to go back to that, is that this is a trend to show what mitochondrial respiration activity was and what percent intensity. And then this is to show what, out of all these papers that looked at VO2 max, where the trend was for performance. So it's just to show that you can do it a million different ways, and there's quite a lot of variability, and that's what we talked about, and that's the bars or the extended lines from the square. But virtually all of them showed favorable in improvement in the interval training. So that's what that is. Okay, so we're on muscle buffering capacity. Remember, it's not performance. You always have to have a performance measure. So you can look at intervals and try to improve them, but you need a performance measure to see if you're actually improving, regardless of what your goal was physiologically. So then the last thing that I get this question a lot in all different sports. I just got back from a professional sport consulting, and one of their major problems is they don't understand this, recovery from short, high intensity of training. So remember that, say you're a sprinter, this is my one, throw out to the sprinters, that skeletal muscle phosphocreatine, basically our 10 seconds or less, we're going to do 5 to 10 second sprints, and then we're going to recover and we're going to do that again. The recovery of that fuel is dependent on O2 availability. So when someone says, as Tim has mentioned in other presentations, that everyone's okay on the track to go do an effort and then go sit down for 5 or 10 minutes. That's right. And that's probably how we should do a lot of intervals under 2 minutes or less. But we don't do that in the road world or the triathlon world. We think it's about that sustainability or the fatigue resistance. So how many can you do? But if you're really trying to improve that extensive or intensive FRC, you probably need to rest more and make sure the power or the intensity is high enough. But relating it back to this phosphocreatine recovery, that recovery is done with O2 capability. So the higher VO2 max, or the higher respiration, or I should say not respiration of VO2, but the higher content of mitochondria and O2, the faster you'll regenerate the phosphocreatine system. So that's why this is important on sprint training, that you can do sprint training all the time, but if your aerobic system isn't developed, you don't recover to be able to do more. Well, number one, faster, you'll recover faster, and or to do more work. So maybe you could do 8-minute recovery or 5-minute recovery. Those are different. You could accomplish more work in a given session. So the white is the oxygen basically it's a hyperoxic, and the black is in the hypoxic group. So it just shows you that in the recovery phase with less oxygen, it takes you longer to recover. And you guys, within all the presentation, you have the papers, you can go there, you can look at them, and you can see all the references and read it completely if you want to. So now we'll talk about the general interval design. So here's our traditional repetition intervals. You go up, you recover. In running, probably the most important part is this passive recovery. Does that mean a light jog or a just stop and walk at max, or just stop and stand there? There's a big difference in the data between the light jog and same thing in cycling. If you did this, which was change that interval intensity, you change the whole dynamic of the interval regardless of the intensity. So and we'll get into this a little bit more as we go on, but everything is qualified. The interval intensity, the recovery intensity, how long, how much volume, and so on. So this is how we go through it. So this is kind of, we started with this, and this is kind of how everyone thought, 15, 20 years ago. Then people thought, no, I'm going to change it because I'm going to do this. And I'm going to change my recovery intervals, and that's going to change my fatigue resistance. But then again, it changes the system you're actually working. Then now we had a high critical power lactate threshold, and then I would change these intervals to accumulate a certain amount of work in different time frames. So this is basically your programming puzzle. So for me, my number one is the intensity. Then the duration is somewhat important. My relief intervals for me are generally passive or zero, but you can do them a million different ways. It just gets too complicated for me to figure out. And then you could do series of these. So again, you could do 5, now let's make it easy. So you could do 3 intervals. So this would be a number, series, 3 intervals of 3 minutes, that's our duration, at 100% of VO2, that's our intensity. Then you would recover at 0% of VO2 for 3 minutes, and then just repeat that 3 times. Now, then you could rest 5 or 10 minutes, and then repeat that again, and then you would have a time series, or a number of series. So that's your sets and reps. So that's 3 by 3 is your reps, and then you would do 4 sets of that with 5 minutes rest in between. So again, you can come back and look at this, and we can talk about it further, but everything changes if you change one part of that. If you change the intensity, you're changing either the system, well, you're changing everything, the intensity, the system, the duration, the work you're going to get done. And in part 2, I'll show you a bunch of changes in kilojoules of work, trend lines, what your y-intercept start and what your y-intercept finish and power is, and a number of different things with changing just the intensity. But you have to commit this to memory, and then you have to commit it to your consciousness to kind of really understand interval training. All of these things, and the problem is we get lazy and we say VO2 7 by 3 on 3 off, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. So here's our individual variability that we talked about, and this is correlations of individual response. So on the left-hand side we have sprint interval training. On the bottom here we have endurance training, and then this just shows who improved their VO2 peak by doing sprint interval training and what that correlation was with endurance training. So you can see some people, like this person right here, it's 250 milliliters a minute, so they got the same improvement from the sprint interval training as they did the endurance interval training. So does that mean if someone's really fit, will they get the same? So you have to qualify this. How long have they been training? Did they have good fitness? Is this a a homogeneous group? And then why did this person, why did they get so much improvement from the endurance side of things? Was it their phenotype? And this is why when someone prescribes something and we stick to it no matter what for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or a 6-week cycle, you got a problem because you never know if you have this person and you never know if you have that person. So that's our VO2 peak. Now the same thing applies for lactate threshold. If we have a lactate threshold here on our left with sprint interval training and we have it over here, well, this person is somewhat close, 25 over to, a little under 50. That's okay. But this person, or these two up here, got much greater increase from the lactate threshold in the sprint interval training than they did from the endurance training. So it's just an example to show you that there's a ton of variability. Knowing someone's phenotype, which we'll probably get into in part 2 or 3, that will give you a trend to whether you work on someone's weakness or whether you work on their strength. And when you're working on someone's weakness, there's some indications that you can go a little bit too far, or how far do you go to get the improvement. So this is another one of those patterns. So we have the endurance training here in A, and then in B we have sprint interval training. The white box means they improved or they adapted. So this is subject number 1. So they did endurance training and their VO2 max improved. Their lactate threshold improved. The gray box means it was negligible, not much. And the black box means they actually got worse. So as you go across, when you do endurance training, these are all the people in the black box that got worse. Gray box was negligible, and white box, they all improved. So this is 21 subjects there. And then same thing with the sprint interval training. These people got a little bit of improvement, but some in the white got improvement, lactate threshold and so on. So with the right person, you can do a lot of sprint interval training and get improvements in VO2 and peak. There's never one thing. And that's why when we get down the road on some of this, you won't, and especially if you're not prescribing 100% or over 100% intervals, you don't generally see improvement in the data. You'll see it, which thank goodness for Andy and those guys, is that you'll see it in the stamina, time to exhaustion, and some of the fatigue profiles. You won't generally see it in the modeled functional threshold power. You just in the FRC because they weren't max or best efforts sometimes. So just be aware of that and aware of the individual patterns in the response to the training. So here's how it actually looks and what really matters. This is one of the best charts there is. So we have 6 weeks of training to get people set. Then we do 4 weeks of training, another 4 weeks of training, another 4 weeks of training, and post-intervention. We test here. So these people they all did 8 sessions of 4x16, 4x8, or 4x4. Or reverse that pattern, 4x4, 4x8, or 4x16. Or 4x16, 8, and 4 of all different sessions. 4x16, 8, and 4, all different sessions, and same thing for all 4-week pattern. And they were all the same. So I think, and that's kind of the summary that I wanted to present at the beginning. You can do this completely reverse or all screwed up for what someone would swear to you is the right way to do it, and you'll get about 95% success rate. All right, so I mean, I could go through this on and on, but they all performed the same level. There was no change in performance other than they all improved. Not one group was better than the other. So if anyone ever tells you exactly how you have to progress intervals, then you can either show them this or you can do it yourself, I guess, and reverse them, and I bet you'll get the same results. So this is different interval training on TT performance. So we have 12 bouts, 30 seconds at 105%, 175% with a 4.5 minute interval. We have 12 bouts of 1 minute, So this is a 6-minute work. This is 12 minutes of work, 24 minutes of work, 32 minutes of work, 32 minutes of work. So in this group, we're changing the intensity. So it's 85% versus 80 and longer intervals. Rest interval is shorter. So this is, and you should come back to this in the PDF version so you can get a handle. As I'm going through the presentation, it gets a little odd when you're trying to make sense of it all. But you have increased intensity. So you're changing the intensity. You're changing the time of the work. You're lengthening the interval. Therefore, you're lowering the intensity. You're shortening the interval. Therefore, you raise the intensity. But yet I gave less recovery, more recovery. So that's where this all starts to get in the a little bit complicated. So then we looked at each of those groups again. So we had the 30-second group, 1-minute group, 2-minute group, 4-minute, and 8-minute. So when you're looking at the percentage of change in a 40K TT, then we look at this peak. We look at the change in, or the speed peak, the peak power, and the sprint power. So everyone would say, you know, anecdotally, if you do 30 seconds, well, heck, yeah, your sprint power should be better. But 40K, probably not going to do it. But peak power should have been better. So the peak power improved a little bit, but not as much as the 4-minute efforts at 85% with a minute and a half rest. And the TT performance, which is really most important to me, or the change in improvement in speed, it's kind of distributed, but you get a good improvement in the 30-second. You get kind of general improvement for everyone who did the 4 minutes, and it's still the 32 minutes with the total work time. And then this percent improvement was not much in the 8-minute efforts, which would, you know, in theory, when people are doing time trial efforts. So what this tells you is nothing. It tells you that, did I need to go at 85% for the 8 minutes? Did I need to go, well, this seems like it worked, so that's positive. Could I get it to work better? Or are 30 seconds not right? No, this person right here really, they got more than a 4% improvement in their 4K. So don't look at, what the worst thing you can do is go home and say, now I need to do 30-second sprints to improve my 40K, or you shouldn't do 8-minute intervals to, or else it's going to decrease your 40K. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. But that's also a point to individuality. You can see how it's skewed. So now we'll do, this is exactly the same type of thing. So we have this set of boxes here. And so we have 5 by 3 minutes on at 90% velocity of VO2. This is running, so for our triathletes out there. And at 90 seconds, 0 effort. So that's standing or walking. So we get our improvements here. So then we have 5 by 5 minutes, 92 velocity of VO2 max, 2.5 minutes at 46%, so they didn't recover completely, and so on. So you can get the point. But this is time at VO2, time at VO2 max, 90% and 95%. So the white here is they got that's 13% of time at VO2 max. So you start to see what were you working on? Did you need a lactate tolerance? Well, the lactates here are 5.7. Here they're 6.5. All right? No, I needed time at a certain amount of intensity. So then the gray bar, this is 21% at 95% of VO2. So again, the longer interval, the more time at VO2 if the recovery is somewhat the same, 2.5 minutes. But if I did sets of this, so this is 3 times 2 sets of 2 minutes at 100% VO2 with 2 minutes rest, but not full recovery. So they got a lot of time in, but they still only got 14% of time at VO2. So that's why when you start to structure these things, you have to figure out what amount of time I'm getting at VO2. And we have some charts in the chart library to help with that. So a couple questions to catch up. The basic take-home message is that consistency is the key. Whatever your approach, just be consistent, and you'll be part of the 95%. I would, yeah. This is like knowing a little bit of karate in a fist fight. You'll just end up getting killed. So it's better to be consistent, show that you made improvements. If you can't see the improvements in the raw data, like the 3-minute max power, or you don't prescribe them that way, you should see improvement in your fatigue resistance over time. That is, do those intervals over several weeks, do them regularly. Yeah. So I would never have a problem if someone said, I'm going to do 4 days of intervals, or I'm going to do 2 days of double day intervals, and I'm going to be consistent in that, or I'm going to do 6 weeks of only 2 days a week of intervals. You're going to have to structure them. We'll get more into it on, what the long-term beneficial effects of it, but that's the basis of it all. That gets you your 95%. So here's the same thing. So we had this chart. We did these different phases, different types of intervals. Did it get us our total distance? Did it get us our VO2 time? Did it get us the lactates that we were looking at? And a bunch of 30 seconds with 3 minutes rest, the longer VO2 intervals. There's a bunch of different things there. So now, if I change one portion of these intervals, what would that do for me? So in A here at the top, this is intensity. This is duration when you look at it later. This is the recovery intensity. So this white is our time at VO2 max at 90%. How much time at 90% or greater did I get in? Okay? So this is 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. Okay? So in this green, that's at 110% of the velocity of VO2 max. Okay? So this green is 110. Yellow here is 120. Blue, 130% of that velocity at VO2. So you can see the more time you get in, you have to lower the intensity to get the time, the volume, the work in. The harder you go, the less intensity you get in that time at VO2. Now we're talking VO2. Now, if you were talking the lactate buffering system and you go back to that, then it's going to be different. You want the intensity and you want just enough recovery. Too much recovery, then you're going to start back over with the intensity. Or in this case, in these 15-second intervals, you would increase the recovery time or recovery intensity. So you could do 15 seconds in green, 110% of VO2 max, but then if you did 50% in the 15-second recovery and you just kept doing those, then you would get a higher lactate. So in this case, that green gets us to 11. If you go harder, but then you still don't recover enough and the intensity goes down, pretty soon you won't get the lactate levels. In this case, they're just doing hard intensity and then zero recovery or zero intensity during recovery. So 11 is the lactate, and then it obviously goes higher the higher intensity you go. But like I said, if you don't recover or you recover too much, then that changes that lactate if that's your goal. All right? So then same thing. That's 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. This is 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off with 50% recovery. Okay? So again, that's 100%. I'm doing VO2 max at 100% of my VO2 max velocity running in this case, and 30 seconds at 50% of my VO2 max. And then that's the time I spent. But I do less time there in time at VO2 max than if I did the 15 seconds on with less intensity. All right? So as the interval goes too hard, then you can't do the work, so you're not going to be in that VO2 max velocity. And we'll get into part 2 of what's time at VO2 power-wise and what's time at VO2 metabolically. They're a little bit different and they drift over time. Or you could be at threshold power, but you'll have still a max VO2 as you fatigue throughout an interval session. Okay, so duration, same thing. It's as I change the duration, time, then that changes my time at VO2. So if I did 30 seconds here in yellow, I don't get a lot of time at VO2 max of 90% of greater because I fatigue too much. So I got to lengthen the interval but decrease the intensity. So everyone can kind of look at these different ranges. The point is there's a million different ways to do it, and you'll start to look at it. Oh, sorry. And then the last one is the recovery interval. So if you did 0%, 50% in your recovery, 67 or 84, what is the time at VO2 in white? So in this case, this is 30 seconds on at 105% of VO2, 30 seconds off. Then you can see if you recover at 50%, that because you're not recovering completely and you still have enough to come back and do the 30 seconds in intensity, you'll get the most time at VO2. But if you go too far, so you're not allowing your time enough time to recover to get the intensity, then that time at VO2 goes down. So that's the trend that you'll see. So frequency, intensity, duration, the recovery intensity, that's everything that you have to manipulate. So we'll finish kind of with max effort. So to try to describe this. So if I did 12 by 50 second on, 10 second off, 100%, 110% of my maximal functional threshold power, that's 12 minutes worth of work time. That's this first interval. So you can see the red line is our functional threshold power, and the VO2 is the white line that's right above it here. So you can see on how much time was spent at VO2. Then I could do 10 40-second efforts, 20-second recovery at 120% effort for that 40-second work time, and I get 10 minutes worth of work time. All right. Then I do 8 by 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. I've increased the intensity even more, and this is what you get. So now this is threshold training, this is VO2 max training, and this is FRC training on the lower end of FRC. All right, so when you see this is a little less than that FTP FRC training. All right, so those are the 3 different intervals, and we've changed a little of everything from 50 second, 40 to 30. So we've shortened the time, increased the intensity, and increased the recovery time. And all of these are coming down to tempo. So not full for this one, a little more for this one, complete for the last one because of the intensity. So this is a description within WKO4 so you can see. So this was a design of the interval. This was all these intervals within one workout. This is not how I would have done it, but it's working a little bit of everything. So now you've got to decide, do you do these intervals first to pre-fatigue for those, or did you really want the intensity, the 150%, and so should you have done these intervals 3 times, or was this a VO2 max interval? Could we have done maybe 130% and done that 3 times? Or someone could have prescribed it this way, or they could have reversed it, done the intensity first, then a little bit less intensity, and then more volume to finish. So that's the summary of kind of part 1. So now what I need from you guys to email info@wko4.com. So if you have any questions or you heard something or you don't understand or what this means, I will put that into part 2 or part 3 so we can kind of get a cloud-based information of what people have problems with intervals, what builds what doesn't build what, how to structure the intervals, which we'll go to in part 2. I already have part 2 already written, and it's already done. It's just I will add to it and try to correct for what everyone's thinking out there, or if they think I was wrong or I said something, which I probably did. But that's why I put the first slide as I qualify everything I said. So I think that's all I got. So if there's any questions, go ahead and type them, and we'll go from there. And Tim, if you have any thoughts, let me know.
Yeah, Dean. So first of all, thanks so much for doing it. It's always tough to get the kind of science physiology stuff on there. And in my last couple of webinars, I've tried to explain to people it's so hard to take something that you do as a process based on knowledge and then turn around and say, oh, here is the process, right? It's kind of like being a painter and painting art, and then somebody say, explain to me how to paint. Well, you got to start same with like, this is a canvas, this is a brush, right? And that part tends to be reasonably easy. But then when you say, here's how I make it art, it really is a challenge as a presenter, and as a thinker, to say, here is the process. When we designed WKO4, and Dean is part of that team, the idea here was to give tools to think and support that process of learning and thinking. So Dean is giving excellent insight into the physiology and the knowledge and what you really should be looking at intervals. 2 points that I want to add that are so important. One, when Dean said you look at an interval of 1, right? And then he said it later that it's easy to prescribe that way. And if you notice, so many times I ping in the Facebook group or I poke at it like, why did you do, or is it really that way? When you prescribe an interval of 1 and your mind is thinking that, we get so locked into only one way to accomplish it. And then we get locked into, if power drops, go home. Or if it's not a perfect flat top hat kind of interval, it's not good. And that's easy solutions. As you evolve your coaching, your self-coaching, it really is looking, if you look at what Dean does so well, is he looks and he analyzes and he says what's working for this individual or what's not working for the individual. And then he's using that learning to continue to fine-tune his art side against the science, which he spends the time learning. And for so many people who email, I must have received 100 messages after my Max Aerobic presentation, because even though if anybody here watched it, remember I said it's not a training plan. I was trying to teach you, some thinking, and then Dean is going even deeper than what I was showing you here. It's not a training plan, right? These are the tools for you to understand intervals and how to maximize that result. So yes, the idea here is not to come onto the presentation and say, oh great, I should be doing 7 times 3.5 minute intervals. You can. Dean started off and said, if you just kind of followed the system, 90-95%, if you're consistent, and you would probably get some gain. The trick to really getting good at it is everything Dean is showing you here. So,
and really, we'll have more of it in part 2. That's why I was nervous. I put the 95% of what everyone wants in the first 4 slides so you can kind of go home. But in part 2, we'll have all those intervals. We'll have them prescribed, documented in WKO4. We'll have all the trend lines, and we'll get more into the WKO4 side of how you're analyzing them to see if you're improving. But it still doesn't dissuade or take away from this first part. That doesn't tell you how to train necessarily.
Yeah, and my only other point to add to that is one of the biggest breakthroughs that we can credit Dr. Coggin and Kevin and our team, the 4 of us that work on it, which is Dean and myself and Kevin and Andy. The development of knowledge of modeling to be able to model VO2 max is big, and every time somebody posts a VO2 max chart and stuff like that at the workout level, which I know Steve, who's on tonight, posted some new ones on there. Him and Andy have been working on them. They're in the Facebook group. I keep saying this is really important. We should pay attention to this, because the reality is so many of the things we look at in interval analytics and analysis is a surrogate or some type of, oh, we can't have VO2 data because we're not in the lab every day. So we use this other metrics, right? For intervals, which are always some intensity greater than endurance, let's call it, to truly call it an interval, time against VO2 max has a high relevance. It's pretty important. And what people are just starting to finally do with WKO4, and I've been using it for years, is understanding that these modeled metrics, which have a high degree of accuracy for modeling, for anything, I mean, it gives us a new analytic, a new tool, a new analysis to look at these things. So suddenly a lot of people on here, I know you've been hearing about intervals against power and intervals time, and suddenly you're looking at a percentage time against VO2 max and saying, well, why is that important to me? Because that's what you're really doing. VO2 max is the ultimate limiter of threshold. It's the ultimate limiter of maximum oxygen. You can basically utilize the ability to raise VO2 max. It will do some pretty cool things for you across the board. So tracking workouts against it, understanding the time you're spending in those zones and tracking improvement is important. So that's all my
And
additions and 2 cents.
yeah, and really quickly, please email it, because if you email that info@wko4.com with any thought or question, I'll tell you, you're not unique. Sorry. It'll be some question that a lot of people have or have thought of or can improve on, and we'll go through it. So I'm not unique. You're not unique, no matter what trophy you got. So sorry.
Excellent. All right, everybody. So it looks like that's all the questions. Email them into info. We'll put a list together. We're going to schedule Dean's Part 2 webinar here in the next couple of days, and we'll get it up and posted. We've got some other great ones coming in April and May, so we're going to push out a full schedule of a couple of months, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dean, for doing that. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.